I used to believe that a man's reputation was built one day at a time, through the small choices nobody noticed. You showed up when you said you would. You kept your word when it cost you something. You treated people fairly even when no one was watching. After 40 years in the Army and another 20 adjusting to civilian life, I thought I'd learned everything there was to know about earning trust. What I never considered was how quickly that trust could disappear after one terrible afternoon. Lie. 3 days after my best friend Michael Harper died, I stood just inside the entrance of the funeral home, with my hand resting on the brim of my old cap. The room was full of familiar faces, people I'd laughed with over backyard barbecues, neighborhood cookouts, fishing trips, and Christmas dinners stretching back decades. Most of them had watched our children grow up together. We had celebrated promotions, survived layoffs, buried parents, and welcomed grandchildren. Looking around that room should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like walking into a place where everyone had already decided I didn't belong. The conversations didn't stop when I entered, but they changed. Voices became quieter. Eyes drifted away before I could meet them. A few people nodded politely, though their smiles never reached their faces. I couldn't blame them. Rumors move faster than facts, especially in a town small enough that everyone thinks they know the whole story before breakfast. By the time Michael's funeral arrived, I had already heard whispers that I had lied about his last moments, that I'd somehow manipulated a dying man, and that there was money involved. None of it made sense to me, yet none of it seemed unbelievable to the people around me. I had rehearsed dozens of explanations during the sleepless nights since the accident. Every one of them ended the same way, with me breaking the promise I had made beside the lake, while Michael struggled to take his final breaths. That promise wasn't written on paper. There weren't any witnesses. It was only a frightened man looking at someone he'd trusted for more than 40 years and asking for one last act of loyalty. Once I gave him my word, there wasn't another choice to make. Michael's family stood near the front of the room, greeting visitors. Olivia looked exhausted, the kind of tired that settles behind the eyes after too many nights without real sleep. She hugged relatives, accepted condolences, and thanked people for coming, but there was a distance in her expression that hadn't been there before. Ryan stood beside her, wearing a dark suit that looked like he'd bought it in a hurry. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight, and every few minutes he glanced toward the entrance, as though waiting for someone he hoped wouldn't appear. When his eyes finally landed on me, I understood who that someone had been. He walked across the room without hesitation. There wasn't anger in his face as much as certainty, and somehow that hurt even more. Angry people sometimes change their minds. Certain people rarely do. "I didn't think you'd actually come," he said quietly enough that only I could hear. "I came to say goodbye to my friend." He looked at me for a long second before shaking his head. "You already had your chance." There wasn't much I could say to that. If I tried defending myself there in front of Michael's casket, I'd only create the kind of scene Michael himself would have hated. So I simply nodded and stepped aside, allowing another family to approach Ryan with flowers in their hands. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. As I found a seat near the back of the chapel, I noticed two men from Michael's accounting office speaking in hushed voices. They stopped the moment I looked their way. One folded his arms while the other slipped a manila folder beneath his chair. It was an ordinary movement, one that probably meant nothing at all, yet something about the nervousness in their faces stayed with me. Michael had always said, people revealed themselves when they believed no one was paying attention. For the first time since his death, I wondered if someone besides me was carrying a burden they couldn't afford to expose. I reached into my jacket pocket and wrapped my fingers around the small bronze challenge coin Michael had given me almost 15 years earlier. It wasn't worth much to anyone else. We weren't soldiers together. Michael had never served, but he'd found the coin at an estate sale and handed it to me one afternoon with a grin. "You spent your life protecting strangers," he'd said. "Now keep this around so somebody remembers to protect you." I'd laughed at the time because it sounded like something only Michael would say. He had a way of turning simple objects into lifelong traditions. Every birthday after that, he'd ask whether I still had the coin. Every year, I'd pull it from whatever pocket it happened to be in. It became our private joke, one that never seemed important until that morning the minister began speaking, and for a while the room settled into silence. Stories about Michael's generosity floated through the chapel. People smiled through tears as they remembered the man who never forgot birthdays who shoveled neighbors' driveways before they woke up after snowstorms, who somehow found time to coach Little League even during the busiest years of running his business. Every word was true. Listening to those memories made the accusations against me feel even heavier because the Michael everyone described was exactly the man I had known. He would never have wanted suspicion to replace compassion inside his own family. Halfway through the service, I caught Olivia looking toward me. Our eyes met for only a second before she looked away. It was subtle, almost hidden beneath her grief. But I'd known that young woman since the day Michael carried her into the hospital nursery wrapped in a pink blanket. Confusion meant questions, and questions meant she hadn't accepted every story she'd been told. After the service ended, people gathered outside beneath an overcast sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. Small groups formed across the parking lot, speaking quietly while waiting for the procession to the cemetery. I stayed near my truck, hoping to avoid another confrontation when I heard someone call my name. It wasn't Ryan. It wasn't Olivia. It was Rebecca Sloan, Michael's estate attorney. She walked toward me with a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm and a careful expression that told me she had chosen her next words long before crossing the parking lot. Before she said a single thing, she looked over both shoulders to make sure no one was close enough to overhear us. Then, lowering her voice, she asked a question I hadn't expected. "Thomas," she said, "before Michael died, did he give you anything besides his last promise?" Rebecca's question stayed with me long after she walked away to join the funeral procession. I hadn't answered her, not because I didn't want to, but because I honestly didn't know how much she already knew. During my years in the Army, I'd learned that the first person to volunteer information usually lost the advantage. Rebecca wasn't trying to trap me. I trusted her too much for that. Still, Michael had trusted her too, and if she was asking whether he'd given me something besides his final promise, then she must have had a reason. "I'll call you tomorrow," she had said before leaving. "Please, don't ignore me." Those were the last words anyone spoke to me that afternoon. The cemetery overlooked a small hill just outside town, where rows of old maple trees had stood longer than most of the people buried beneath them. Michael and I had walked those grounds more than once over the years, visiting our parents' graves on Memorial Day. Neither of us had imagined one of us would be resting there before the other. As the service ended and people slowly returned to their cars, I stayed behind until the crowd had almost disappeared. It wasn't because I wanted to be alone. I just wasn't ready to say goodbye to the only friend who had known nearly every version of the man I'd been. On the drive home, I took the long route past Harper Industrial Supply. Michael had started the company in a rented warehouse nearly 30 years earlier. At first, it had been nothing more than shelving, hand tools, and a borrowed delivery truck that rattled louder than its engine should have allowed. I still remembered spending weekends helping him unload inventory after finishing my own shifts. Neither of us thought about overtime or ownership. Friends didn't keep score. The parking lot was nearly empty that evening. A few lights still glowed inside the office windows, but the loading docks were quiet. For a moment, I almost pulled in just to sit there and remember how it all began. Instead, I kept driving. Something told me it wasn't the right time. When I got home, the silence hit harder than usual. My wife, Linda, had been gone for 6 years. Cancer had taken her faster than either of us expected, and although I had learned how to cook for one and keep the house clean, I'd never learned how to make an empty home feel lived in again. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked louder than it ever had when she was alive. I hung my jacket on the same hook I always used and placed my truck keys beside the bowl on the kitchen counter. It was a routine so ordinary that I barely noticed it anymore. Only then did I realize the challenge coin was still in my pocket. I turned it over in my hand and smiled despite everything. Why? Michael had scratched a tiny mark near the edge years ago after dropping it onto the concrete floor of his garage. "So now you'll know if somebody swaps it," he joked. He always found a reason to laugh, even during difficult times. That was one of the things people admired most about him. They saw the successful businessman with an easy smile, but they hadn't known how close he'd come to losing everything during those early years. I did because I'd been there. Back then, Michael wasn't wealthy. He was stubborn. His first warehouse barely had enough room for inventory, and every dollar he earned went back into keeping the doors open. I'd spend Saturday mornings helping him stack boxes while he insisted on buying lunch, even though I knew he couldn't really afford it. "You've got your own family?" I'd tell him. "So do you," he'd answer. "That's why I'm buying. We argued about those lunches for years. Neither of us ever won. As the business slowly grew, our families became even closer. Ryan and Olivia spent summers chasing fireflies in my backyard with my nieces. Michael and Linda organized neighborhood picnics that seemed to get bigger every year. Birthdays turned into traditions. Thanksgiving dinners rotated between our houses, and every Christmas Eve, Michael insisted on bringing over a pecan pie because he claimed nobody else could bake one properly. Looking back now, those memories felt almost too perfect, not because they weren't real, but because they made the present harder to understand. The first time I noticed something changing in Michael was about 8 months before the accident. We were having breakfast at the same little diner we'd visited every Thursday since my retirement. The waitress didn't even ask for our order anymore. Coffee appeared first, followed by scrambled eggs for Michael and oatmeal for me. It was comforting in its predictability. That morning, though, Michael barely touched his food. "You feeling all right?" I asked. He looked up as though I'd interrupted a conversation happening somewhere inside his own head.
Just tired. You've been saying that for weeks.
He smiled, but it wasn't convincing. "Business has been keeping me busy." That answer should have satisfied me. Running a company came with long hours, especially as it expanded. But something about the way he glanced toward the front window every few minutes made me think his mind was somewhere else entirely. Before we left, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small black notebook. "You ever keep a journal?" he asked. I laughed. Army reports cured me of writing anything longer than a grocery list. "This isn't a journal." "What is it?" He hesitated before slipping it back into the briefcase. "Just something I've started doing." I didn't press him. Everyone deserves a little privacy, even from old friends. Still, that notebook became a regular companion after that day. Whether we met for breakfast, fishing, or a ball game, it always seemed to be somewhere nearby. Sometimes he'd write in it for only a minute before closing it again. I assumed he was keeping track of business ideas. However, I imagined he might be documenting something far more serious. About a month later, Michael invited me to walk through one of the company's newest warehouses. He was proud of what he'd built, and he enjoyed showing me every improvement, as though we were still unloading those first dusty shelves together. The employees greeted him warmly. Forklifts hummed through wide aisles. Orders moved steadily toward waiting trucks. It looked like a business that had found its stride. Yet Michael wasn't looking at the equipment. He was watching people every so often. His eyes would settle on an office window overlooking the warehouse floor. The blinds were half closed, and someone inside quickly stepped away from the glass when they noticed us looking up. I followed his gaze. "Everything okay?" He answered a little too quickly. "Yeah, just thinking." That wasn't like him. Michael had never hidden his worries from me before. If a shipment was late, he'd complain. If a customer gave him trouble, I'd hear about it over coffee. If taxes went up, he'd spend 20 minutes explaining why Washington had never run a small business. This silence was different. It wasn't the silence of a man with ordinary problems. It was the silence of someone trying to solve a question before deciding whether he could trust another person with the answer. As we finished the tour and stepped into the parking lot, Michael rested his hand on the roof of my truck and looked back at the warehouse. Then he said something that seemed almost casual at the time. "I've been learning that sometimes the people who smile at you every day are the ones you should watch the closest." I asked him what he meant. Instead of answering, he simply looked at the building one more time, climbed into his own truck, and drove away, leaving me with a question that would grow heavier with every passing week. The next Thursday, Michael acted as though he'd never said those words. He was back to talking about baseball scores, rising fuel prices, and whether the diner had started watering down its coffee. If I hadn't known him as well as I did, I might have believed the worried man from the warehouse parking lot had disappeared. But friendship teaches you to notice the small things. His smile came a second later than it used to, and every time his phone buzzed, he looked at the screen before deciding whether to answer. Most of the time, he slipped it back into his pocket without saying a word. I told myself not to imagine problems where there weren't any. After all, people in their 60s carried enough responsibilities without inviting new ones. Michael's company had grown far beyond those early warehouse days. He employed more than 100 people now, many of whom had been with him for years. Payroll alone was enough to keep anyone awake at night. If something was bothering him, it might simply be the weight of running a successful business. Even so, I couldn't ignore the feeling that he wanted to tell me something, but hadn't yet decided how. A few weeks later, he called me on a Tuesday evening instead of our usual Thursday morning. "Can you meet me at the office?" he asked. His voice wasn't panicked, but it carried an urgency I wasn't used to hearing. "Everything all right?" "I hope so." That wasn't much of an answer, but it was enough for me to grab my keys. By the time I reached Harper Industrial Supply, most of the employees had already gone home. The parking lot, usually crowded during the day, held only a handful of vehicles. Michael was standing near the loading dock with 2 cups of coffee balanced on the tailgate of an old pickup truck. It was the same truck he'd refused to sell for years, insisting it reminded him where he'd started. "You still buy the cheap stuff," I said, taking one of the cups. He smiled. "Tastes better when you don't spend $6 on it." For a few minutes, we talked about nothing important. It almost felt like he'd invited me there just to catch up. Then he grew quiet and looked across the warehouse yard where the security lights had begun casting long shadows over the pavement. "Do you remember the first employee I ever hired?" he asked. "Luis Moreno. He was 18 and terrified of driving that old forklift." Michael chuckled. "He nearly knocked over every shelf in the place, but he learned." He did. There was another long silence. "I've always believed this company belonged to more than me," he said finally. "Families depend on these paychecks. Kids went to college because this place stayed open. Mortgages got paid because people trusted me to make the right decisions. You did. I've tried." The way he said those words caught my attention. "Tried?" He rubbed the coffee cup between his hands before answering. "Tell me something, Tom. If you started noticing little things that didn't add up, how long would you watch before saying something?" I thought about it for a moment. "Depends on what kind of things." Leading. "What if you weren't sure they were connected?" "Then I'd keep looking." He nodded slowly, almost as if I'd confirmed something he'd already believed. "That's what I've been doing." Before I could ask another question, headlights swept across the parking lot. Dark SUV pulled into one of the reserved spaces near the office entrance. The driver stepped out carrying a leather briefcase and disappeared inside without acknowledging either of us. Michael watched until the office door closed. "He wasn't supposed to be here tonight," he murmured. "Who is he?" "Our outside financial consultant? You don't sound happy to see him." "I'm surprised." The hesitation in his voice was impossible to miss. "We finished our coffee," Michael suggested. "We walked through the warehouse one last time before I headed home." The building felt different after hours. Without forklifts moving and employees talking, every footstep echoed across the concrete floor. The rows of shelving stretched into the distance beneath bright overhead lights, making the place seem larger than it did during the day. As we passed the shipping office, I noticed the door was slightly open. Inside, someone had left a stack of invoices spread across a desk. Michael stopped walking. He didn't touch the papers. He simply looked at them for several seconds before quietly pulling the door shut. "Come on," he said. "You don't want to check those? Not tonight." His answer surprised me. The Michael I'd known for 40 years would never have ignored unfinished paperwork. He believed every problem became easier once you looked it in the eye. Walking away wasn't in his nature. Outside again, we stood beside my truck. "I've been making copies," he said suddenly. "Copies of what? Just records. What kind of records?" He smiled, though it carried very little warmth. "The kind you hope you'll never need." I studied him for a moment. "Mike, you in some kind of trouble?" He looked me straight in the eye. "I honestly don't know." That answer bothered me more than if he'd simply said yes. For the first time in our friendship, Michael sounded like a man standing on uncertain ground. Before we parted, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and handed me a small brass key attached to a faded blue tag. "Hold on to this," I frowned. "What is it?" "The spare key to my original office. I don't need your office key." "I know." "Then why are you giving it to me?" He shrugged as though it wasn't important. "Because I trust you." I turned the key over in my hand. The blue tag had faded so badly I could barely read the handwritten number on it. "You want me to keep this at home? For now. What happens if you need it?" "I'll ask." There were a dozen questions I wanted to ask, but something told me he wouldn't answer them that night. When I got home, I dropped the key into the small wooden box where I kept spare house keys, old military pins, and a few keepsakes Linda had treasured. It seemed like an ordinary favor between old friends. I didn't mention it to anyone, and within a few days, I almost forgot it was there. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm, at least on the surface. Then Rebecca Sloan called. She wasn't Michael's attorney because she liked courtroom battles. She'd built her reputation by helping families avoid them. calm, organized, and impossible to rattle. Rebecca had handled everything from business contracts to wills for as long as I could remember. Thomas, she said after exchanging a few pleasantries, Michael asked me to schedule a review of his estate documents. That sounds normal. It is. So why are you calling me? There was a brief pause. Because he asked if you could be available next month in case he wanted a witness present. A witness to what? He didn't say. I laughed softly. That sounds like Michael, it does. But you sound concerned. I don't like unanswered questions, neither do I. She hesitated. If he asks you to attend, I hope you will. I will. After we ended the call, I found myself thinking less about the estate meeting and more about everything that happened over the past few months. The notebook, the copied records, the consultant showing up unexpectedly, the warehouse office, the brass key resting quietly in my wooden box. Individually, none of those things seemed unusual. Together, they formed a picture I still couldn't quite understand, and somewhere inside that picture was a piece that Michael hadn't shown me yet. A estate meeting never happened. At least, not the way Rebecca and I expected. About 2 weeks after her call, Michael invited me over for dinner. It wasn't unusual. We'd shared enough meals over the years that neither of us bothered with formal invitations anymore. If one of us was grilling steaks, the other usually ended up at the table. Ryan was supposed to stop by later that evening, and Olivia had promised to bring dessert after work. It sounded like an ordinary family night, the kind Michael always tried to protect no matter how busy life became. When I arrived, he was standing on the back patio turning burgers over a charcoal grill. The smell carried me back 20 years, when our kids would race around the yard while he insisted charcoal tasted better than gas. We argued about that almost every summer, and neither of us ever changed our minds. You still using lighter fluid like it's free? I asked. He grinned. You're still complaining about it like you're paying for it. For a little while, everything felt normal again. We ate outside while the sun settled behind the trees. Ryan talked about expanding one of the company's distribution routes, and Olivia laughed at a story about her youngest son, trying to teach the family dog to fetch the television remote. Michael listened more than he spoke. I noticed him watching his children when they weren't looking, almost as though he were trying to memorize the moment. It struck me as odd, but grief has a way of rewriting old memories. Sometimes I wondered if I only remembered those little details because I knew what was coming. After dinner, Olivia gathered the plates and carried them inside. Ryan stepped away to answer a phone call. For the first time that evening, Michael and I found ourselves alone. You still have that key? He asked quietly. I do. Good. I've got to admit, Mike, I'm starting to wonder why. He rested both hands on the patio railing before answering. Have you ever spent years building something, then suddenly felt like you didn't know everything happening inside it anymore? The company? He nodded. I used to know every invoice, every customer, every truck that left the loading dock. Now there are departments I barely recognize. That's what happens when a business grows. Maybe. He didn't sound convinced. I've been checking things myself, he continued, nothing dramatic. Just numbers, reports, vendor payments, and they're close. Close to what? He sighed. Close enough that most people would never notice. I waited. But close isn't always honest. Before I could ask another question, Ryan returned to the patio. Whatever he'd been discussing on the phone had clearly frustrated him. We've got another vendor asking about delayed payments, he said. Michael looked surprised. Delayed? They claim accounting's behind. I wasn't aware of that. Ryan shrugged. It's being handled. Something passed between them that lasted only a second. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't even disagreement. It was simply a look, a father realizing he no longer knew as much about his own business as he thought he did. Michael let the subject drop, so did I. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Michael walked me to my truck. I appreciate you coming, Lee. You know you never have to thank me. I know. He looked toward the house to make sure no one was nearby. If anything ever happens, I frowned. Don't start talking like that. Hear me out. I don't like conversations that begin with if anything ever happens. He smiled faintly. Neither do I. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I was going to give you this. I extended my hand. Instead of placing it there, he stopped. After a long moment, he slipped the paper back into his pocket. Not yet. What changed? I'm still missing one piece. One piece of what? The truth. He patted my shoulder. When I know for certain, you'll know too. I watched him walk back toward the house. wondering what could possibly make a man as careful as Michael speak in riddles. A few days later, he called and asked if I wanted to spend Saturday morning at Lake Ashcroft. We'd been fishing there since our 40s. Neither of us cared much whether we caught anything. The lake gave us an excuse to escape phones, paperwork, and responsibilities for a few hours. Saturday dawned cool and clear. The water looked almost perfectly still as we launched Michael's small aluminum fishing boat. We drifted toward the northern shoreline where fallen trees created good cover for base. For nearly an hour, we talked about everything except business. He asked about my grandson. I asked about Olivia's family. We debated whether the local baseball team had any chance of making the playoffs. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Then Michael put down his fishing rod. You remember Luis? The first employee. He came to see me yesterday. Everything okay? He said something strange. What was that? He thanked me for always protecting the people who worked for me. That doesn't sound strange. It wasn't the thanks. What was? Lee. He said he hoped I wouldn't stop now. I turned toward him. What did he mean? He wouldn't explain. The breeze had begun pushing the boat gently across the water. Michael stared toward the shoreline. I've spent months wondering whether I'm imagining things, and now I don't think I am anymore. I could hear the weight in his voice. What exactly do you think is happening? He took a long breath. I think someone has been using my company for something I never approved. My stomach tightened. Stealing? I don't know. Fraud? I don't know. Then what do you know? He looked down at the tackle box resting between us. I know money has been moving in ways I can't explain. Have you called the police? Not yet. Why not? Because if I'm wrong, I'll destroy innocent people. And if you're right. His answer came almost as a whisper. Then someone close to me has been lying for a very long time. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The lake had become strangely quiet. Even the birds seemed farther away. Finally, Michael opened the storage compartment beneath his seat and removed a plain manila envelope sealed with clear tape. He held it in both hands without offering it to me. I've been making copies of everything. The records? He nodded. This isn't all of it. What is it? The beginning. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. You want me to keep it? I haven't decided. He smiled sadly. Funny, isn't it? What is? I've trusted people with million-dollar contracts without losing a minute of sleep. Look. He glanced down at the envelope again. He stopped himself. Feels heavier. Before I could answer, the sharp ring of his cell phone broke the silence. He glanced at the screen. Lie. The name flashing there immediately drained the color from his face. He didn't answer. Instead, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked across the lake with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't fear. It was disappointment. The kind that only comes when someone you trusted has just confirmed your worst suspicion. He slowly set the sealed envelope back inside the storage compartment, closed the lid, and quietly said something that wouldn't make sense to me until much later. Boy, I was hoping I'd be wrong. Michael's words hung over the lake long after he said them. I wanted to ask whose name had appeared on his phone, what had convinced him he was right, and why he looked more disappointed than frightened. Every instinct I had, sharpened by years in the army, told me to keep asking until I understood. But someone had taught me something just as valuable. When someone you've trusted for 40 to say, pushing harder rarely helps. Instead, and cast my line back into the water. If you need me, I said quietly, you already know the answer. He nodded without looking at me. I do. For another half hour, we fished in near silence. The peaceful morning had changed without either of us noticing exactly when. The conversation about baseball seemed to belong to another day. Even the lake felt different now, as if the still water had absorbed the weight of everything Michael wasn't saying. Eventually, he stood and stretched. I think we've been out here long enough. We heading back? Yeah. He started the small outboard motor, and the boat turned slowly toward the public dock. We weren't far from shore, maybe a few hundred yards. When Michael reached into his jacket pocket to check his phone again, his expression tightened. The same caller? I asked. He looked at the screen for a long moment before locking it. Yes, still not answering? Not yet. Lie. He slipped the phone away and rested one hand on the steering handle. I need a favor. You've never had to ask. If anything happens before, I can explain everything. I sighed. Mike, I know you keep saying that because I don't have much time. The words caught me off guard. What do you mean you don't have much time? I don't mean I'm dying. He gave a tired smile. I mean, whoever's doing this is running out of reasons to be patient. I felt my stomach tighten. Loot, you really think it's that serious? I didn't a month ago. And now? I think someone's becoming desperate. The shoreline was getting closer. I could already make out a couple loading their canoe farther down the dock and an older man untangling fishing line near the boat ramp. It looked like an ordinary Saturday morning. Then Michael reached beneath his seat. When he pulled his hand back out, he was holding the same sealed manila envelope. He placed it on the bench between us. If I hand this to you, he stopped speaking. If you hand it to me, I replied, I'll keep it safe. He looked down at it for several seconds. No. He picked it up again. Not yet. I couldn't hide my frustration. You either trust me or you don't. His eyes met mine immediately. I trust you. Why keep changing your mind? Because if this leaves my hands too early, he looked toward the shoreline before finishing his sentence. The wrong person will know I've figured it out. That answer made more sense than any he'd given me before. So you're waiting. I'm waiting until I know exactly where the last piece fits. The motor sputtered once. Michael frowned. That's strange. The engine had always been reliable. He eased back on the throttle and tried again. This time it caught, but the sound was rougher than before. You serviced it recently? I asked. Last month. He leaned over slightly, listening. Probably bad fuel. The explanation seemed reasonable. We continued another 50 yards before the engine coughed again. Much harder this time. Michael shifted the throttle. Nothing, the boat slowed until we were drifting. I'll take a look, he said. He moved toward the rear of the boat and lifted the engine cover. I stayed seated, trying not to upset our balance. See anything? Not yet. He reached down toward the fuel line. Then everything happened so quickly that even now, years later, I can still replay each second with painful clarity. The boat rocked sharply beneath us. Michael lost his footing. He grabbed for the side of the engine housing, but missed. His shoulder struck the edge of the transom before he disappeared into the water. Mike. I was on my feet before the splash settled. He surfaced almost immediately, gasping more from surprise than panic. I'm okay, he called. But something wasn't right. Lead. He wasn't swimming toward the boat. Instead, one arm stayed strangely close to his body. I dropped to my knees and reached over the side. Grab my hand. He tried. His fingers brushed mine for the briefest moment before slipping away. The boat drifted just out of reach. I threw the life ring as quickly as I could. It landed only a few feet away. Mike. He turned toward it, but didn't move fast enough. His face tightened with pain. Only then did I notice the dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his shirt, where he'd struck the metal edge of the boat. He wasn't simply tired. He was hurt. I lunged for the emergency paddle and pulled the boat toward him with desperate, uneven strokes. Every inch felt impossibly slow. Hold on, I shouted. I'm trying, he answered. Those were the last full words I ever heard him speak. By the time I reached him, he'd managed to grab the life ring, but he looked pale, far too pale. With every bit of strength I had, I hauled him against the side of the boat. Getting him back inside should have been easy. We'd helped each other into boats 100 times over the years. This time, his body wouldn't cooperate. He winced as I lifted beneath his arm. My shoulder, he whispered. I know. No. He struggled for another breath. Not. Just. His voice faded. I managed to get half his body across the edge before another wave shifted the boat. Somehow I pulled him the rest of the way inside, and we both collapsed onto the aluminum floor. He was breathing, but barely. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called 911, giving the dispatcher our location as calmly as I could manage. They told me help was already on the way. It felt like forever. Michael opened his eyes once. He looked directly at me. There was no panic anymore, only urgency. Tom, I'm here. He swallowed with obvious difficulty. Listen, I'm listening. He reached weakly toward my jacket pocket. The coin confused. I pulled out the old Army Challenge coin he'd given me years before. He closed his hand around mine. Then, with more effort than I'd ever seen him use to speak, he whispered the words that would change the rest of my life. Don't tell them yet. I stared at him. What? They'll destroy. He stopped to catch another breath. Everything. I don't understand. His grip tightened surprisingly hard for just a moment. Promise me. I can't promise something I don't understand. His eyes never left mine. Promise. I had never seen Michael Harper afraid. Not when his first business nearly failed. Not when his wife underwent heart surgery years earlier. Not during the recession that almost forced him to lay people off. But in that moment, he wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid of what would happen after he was gone, so I gave him the only thing he asked for. I promise. His grip relaxed. A faint expression of relief crossed his face. Then, almost too quietly to hear above the rippling water, he added one final sentence. The truth, we'll know when it's time. His hand slipped from mine just as the distant sound of approaching sirens echoed across the lake. The paramedics reached us within minutes, though it felt much longer. By then, a park ranger had maneuvered another boat alongside ours, and together, we managed to stabilize Michael while we headed toward the dock. I answered every question they asked as clearly as I could, repeating the sequence of events over and over until the words stopped sounding like my own. Michael had lost his footing after the engine failed, struck his shoulder on the transom, fallen into the water, and struggled to climb back aboard because of the injury. That was the truth as I knew it. It just wasn't the whole truth. At the hospital, they led me into a small family waiting room with pale walls and a coffee machine that hummed louder than anyone speaking inside it. A nurse offered me water I never drank. Another asked if there was someone she could call for me. I gave her Ryan's number, then Olivia's, though I suspected they had already been contacted. Sitting there alone, I realized my hands were still trembling. When I finally looked down, Michael's challenge coin was resting in my palm. I couldn't remember putting it there after he let go of my hand. The doctor came through the doors almost an hour later. He removed his glasses before he spoke, and I knew what he was going to say before he opened his mouth. I'm very sorry. Those two words have a way of making time stop. I don't remember standing, but somehow I was on my feet. I thanked the doctor because it seemed like the polite thing to do, even though nothing about that moment deserved politeness. He explained the injuries in careful medical language. The impact had done more damage than any of us realized. They had tried everything they could. I listened because he deserved my attention, but my mind had already drifted back to the lake, to Michael asking me for one last promise while I kept telling him I didn't understand. Ryan arrived first. He pushed through the waiting room doors, looking as though he'd driven faster than he should have. The moment he saw my face, he didn't ask a single question. He already knew for a second I thought he was going to hug me. Instead, he stopped a few feet away. Were you with him the whole time?
Yes. What happened?
I told him exactly what I'd told the paramedics and the doctor. I didn't leave anything out about the accident itself. I described the engine cutting out, Michael losing his balance, the fall, the struggle to pull him back into the boat, the call to emergency services. Ryan listened without interrupting, but something in his expression hardened when I reached the end. That's all he said? I hesitated. He spoke a little. What did he say? There it was, the question I'd known was coming. Looked down for just a moment before meeting his eyes again. He asked me to promise him something. Ryan stepped closer. What? I'm sorry. His face tightened. You promised him, didn't you? Yes. And you're not going to tell me? I can't. His grief changed almost instantly into frustration. I'm his son, I know. If my father had something to say before he died, I have a right to hear it. I understand why you feel that way. Then tell me. Every part of me wanted to. If Michael had asked me to deliver a message of love, I would have done it before the sun went down. If he'd wanted his children to know he was proud of them, I'd have repeated every word exactly as he said it. But this was different. He hadn't asked me to pass along a message. He had asked me not to. I gave him my word, I said quietly. Ryan stared at me for several long seconds. I can't believe you'd choose a promise over his family. Before I could answer, Olivia entered the waiting room. She had clearly been crying during the drive to the hospital. The moment she learned her father was gone, she wrapped her arms around me without saying a word. We stood there for a long time, grieving the same man in different ways. When she finally stepped back, she noticed the tension between Ryan and me. What's going on? Ryan answered before I could. Dad said something to him before he died. Olivia looked at me. Is that true? Yes. What was it? I felt the weight of both their eyes. I'm sorry. She didn't become angry the way Ryan had. Instead, confusion settled across her face. You're really not going to tell us? I can't. She searched my expression as though hoping to find some explanation beyond the words themselves. My father trusted you. I know, so do we. Those words hurt more than the accusation Ryan had thrown at me, or perhaps they had trusted me. I wasn't so sure anymore. The days that followed blurred together in a way grief often does. Detectives interviewed me about the accident twice, asking many of the same questions the park rangers had asked at the lake. They inspected the boat, photographed the damaged engine, and requested copies of my phone records to verify the emergency call. Detective Alan Brooks handled most of the interviews. He wasn't suspicious or aggressive. If anything, he seemed determined to avoid reaching conclusions too quickly. Accidents have a way of collecting rumors, he told me after one interview. I've noticed. My job is to separate those from facts. I appreciate that. He closed his notebook. If you remember anything else, even if it seems unimportant, call me. I almost laughed at the irony. The one thing that mattered most was the one thing I couldn't tell him. A week after the funeral, Rebecca Sloan called exactly as she'd promised. Can you come by my office this afternoon? I'll be there. When I arrived, she closed the door before either of us sat down. The blinds were drawn even though it was the middle of the day. Ryan believes you're hiding something. He isn't wrong. I assumed as much. She folded her hands across her desk. I'm not asking you to break your promise. Relief washed over me. Thank you. But I do need to know one thing. I waited. Did Michael ask you to conceal information permanently? She paused carefully. Or temporarily? That question was different. I thought back to the lake. I remembered every pause, every strained breath, every word he forced himself to say. Temporarily. Rebecca nodded slowly, as though confirming a suspicion she'd been carrying. I hoped you'd say that. What makes you think that? Because Michael visited me 3 times over the past 6 months. I leaned forward. He never mentioned that. He wouldn't have. She opened a file on her desk but kept its contents turned away from me. Each visit involved revisions to business documents, estate instructions, and contingency plans. Contingency for what? He never fully explained. She looked at me for a long moment, but he kept asking me the same question.
What question? If the truth couldn't come out immediately, she took a quiet breath.
How could it still be protected? The room fell silent for the first time since the accident. I realized Michael hadn't been planning for his own death. He had been planning for what might happen if he wasn't there to finish what he'd started. And somewhere inside those unfinished plans was the reason he had trusted me with a promise instead of an explanation. Rebecca's office felt smaller after that realization. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy. Michael had never been a man who prepared for imaginary disasters. If he had spent months revising legal documents and asking questions about protecting the truth after he was gone, then he had seen something serious enough to make him plan for the worst. What troubled me most was that he had never once asked me to investigate anything. He hadn't wanted me to become a detective. He had only wanted me to keep my word. I wish I could tell you more, Rebecca said quietly. I know. I'm bound by attorney-client privilege, just as you're bound by your promise. I gave a tired smile. Seems Michael managed to put both of us in the same position. He trusted carefully. He always did. Rebecca closed the file and slid it back into her cabinet. There is one thing I can tell you. I looked up before each meeting ended. He reminded me that documents can disappear. That caught my attention. He actually said that? He did. And then? He'd smile and say the truth is harder to destroy than paper. The words sounded exactly like Michael. He'd always believed character outlasted circumstances. Even when business was difficult in the early years, he never chased shortcuts. He used to tell young employees that mistakes could be fixed, but dishonesty stayed with a person much longer than failure ever would. As I drove home, I found myself replaying every conversation we'd had during the previous year. The notebook, the copied records, the office key resting in my wooden box, the sealed envelope he almost handed me twice. None of those memories felt random anymore. They fit together somehow, but I still couldn't see the full picture. The following Monday morning, I was trimming the hedges in my front yard when I noticed a familiar pickup truck pulling into the driveway. It belonged to Luis Moreno. Time had added gray to his hair, but he still climbed out with the same steady confidence I'd remembered from the warehouse all those years ago. He had started with Michael at 18, terrified of operating a forklift, and had eventually become the warehouse supervisor everyone respected. "Look, I hope I'm not bothering you," he said.
Not at all.
We sat on the front porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. For a while, we talked about ordinary things, his grandchildren, my vegetable garden, the unusually hot summer. Eventually, the conversation settled where we both knew it would. "I still can't believe Mike's gone," he said softly. "Neither can I." Louis stared across the street for several moments before speaking again. "People have been saying things. I've heard. I don't believe them. I appreciated that more than I could explain. Thank you, but..." He hesitated. I think Mike knew something was wrong. My eyes met his. What makes you say that? He started asking questions. What kind of questions? Purchase orders, vendor payments, inventory that didn't match shipping reports. I listened carefully. Did he think someone was stealing? Lewis shook his head. I never heard him accuse anyone. Then why ask? He said numbers tell stories. That sounded exactly like Michael. Lewis leaned forward. About a month before he died, he walked through the warehouse with me after everyone else had gone home. The night we were there? You were there too? I met him afterward. Lewis nodded slowly. He asked whether I'd noticed anything unusual. What did you tell him? I said no. Was that true? He looked down at the glass in his hands. Mostly? I'd noticed trucks leaving later than normal. Late deliveries? They weren't on the shipping schedule. My pulse quickened. Did you report it? I asked accounting, and they told me the paperwork would be updated later. Did it? I don't know. There was no drama in Luis's voice. He wasn't trying to accuse anyone. If anything, he sounded frustrated that he hadn't pushed harder. I keep thinking, he said quietly. Maybe I should have asked more questions. I understood that feeling all too well. After he left, I found myself standing in the garage longer than necessary. My eyes drifted toward the old wooden cabinet where I kept spare keys and keepsakes. For nearly a minute, I simply stared at it. Finally, I opened the drawer. The brass office key was exactly where I'd left it. I turned it over in my hand, remembering Michael's words, "Because I trust you." Until that moment, I had never considered using it. It hadn't belonged to me. Michael had never actually told me to unlock anything. But now another thought had taken hold. He had also never asked for it back. That afternoon, I drove to Harper Industrial Supply for the first time since the funeral. The parking lot was as busy as ever. Livery trucks rolled in and out of the loading docks while employees moved steadily between buildings. On the surface, nothing had changed. Business continued exactly as Michael would have wanted. Inside the reception area, several employees greeted me warmly. A few offered condolences. Others looked uncertain, as though they weren't sure whether speaking to me might create problems. Ryan stepped out of the main office before I reached the hallway. His expression hardened immediately. What are you doing here? For what? I helped build this place. You helped. His emphasis didn't go unnoticed. But it's my responsibility now. I know. He folded his arms. If you're looking for Dad's office, it's locked. I wasn't. That wasn't entirely true. Ryan studied me for several uncomfortable seconds. I think it's best if we keep some distance for a while. I never wanted distance. No? His voice remained calm, but the hurt beneath it was obvious. Then why are you still keeping his last words from us? There wasn't an answer he would accept. I made a promise. My father never kept secrets from family. Why? I wanted to tell him that Michael hadn't been keeping secrets from his family. He'd been protecting them. But I couldn't. I hope one day you'll understand. Ryan shook his head. I hope one day you'll finally tell the truth. He turned and walked back toward the offices before I could respond. As I left the building, disappointment settled over me more heavily than anger ever could have. Ryan wasn't acting out of greed or cruelty. He genuinely believed I was withholding something that belonged to his family. If our positions had been reversed, I wasn't entirely sure I wouldn't have felt the same way. I had almost reached my truck when someone called my name. It was Detective Alan Brooks. He had parked beside the loading docks and was carrying a thin folder beneath one arm. Mr. Reed, detective. I was hoping I'd run into you. Everything all right? He glanced toward the warehouse before lowering his voice. We finished examining Michael's boat. What did you find? The engine failure wasn't caused by bad fuel. I felt my stomach tighten. What caused it? He opened the folder just enough to glance at a report. Someone disconnected the primary fuel line. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I managed to ask the only question that mattered. Are you saying it wasn't an accident? Detective Brooks closed the folder slowly. I'm saying, he looked directly into my eyes. I don't believe we've been asking the right questions. Detective Brooks's words followed me all the way home. I had driven that road hundreds of times over the years, but I couldn't remember a single mile of it that afternoon. My hands stayed on the steering wheel out of habit, while my mind kept returning to one impossible thought. If the fuel line had been disconnected before Michael and I left the dock, then the engine hadn't simply failed. Someone had made sure it would. I sat in my driveway for several minutes before turning off the engine. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. A teenager rode past on a bicycle. Someone across the street was mowing a lawn. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Ordinary life continued without the slightest hint that the story everyone believed about Michael's death might be wrong. I finally went inside and called Detective Brooks. "I've been thinking about what you said." "So have I," he replied. "Was the fuel line cut?" "No." "Then how was it disconnected?" "It had been loosened just enough that vibration would eventually separate it. So it wasn't random." "No." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "Could it have happened during routine maintenance?" "There are a few possibilities, but you don't believe that's what happened." "I believe someone who understood engines knew exactly how long it would probably take before the line came loose." His answer sent a chill through me. "Have you told Ryan?" "Not yet." "Why?" "Because we're still verifying a few things." There was a pause before he continued. "I also don't want rumors getting ahead of evidence." That sounded like the detective I'd come to respect. "What do you need from me?" "For now?" "Yes. If Michael ever mentioned being worried about someone around the business, I need to know." I closed my eyes. He had. More than once, but never by name. He said he thought someone had been lying to him. Did he identify who? No. Did he describe the problem? He mentioned numbers that didn't add up. Brooks was quiet for several seconds. "That's helpful. It doesn't feel like enough." "Why?" "It may be more important than you realize." After we ended the call, I walked into the garage and opened the wooden cabinet again. The brass office key lay exactly where I'd left it. Beside it rested Linda's old recipe cards, a handful of military pins, and a faded photograph of Michael and me standing beside his first delivery truck. I picked up the key and held it in my hand for a long time. Michael hadn't told me to use it, but he had trusted me with it. The next morning, I called Rebecca. "I think it's time we talked." "I was hoping you'd say that." An hour later, we met in her office. Before I sat down, I placed the brass key on her desk. "I've had this for months." She recognized it immediately. "His original office? You knew?" "Drafted the paperwork when he bought the building." She looked at the key without touching it. "Did he ever tell you why he gave it to you?" "No." She folded her hands together. "Then we shouldn't assume." I appreciated that answer. Neither of us wanted to force meaning into something Michael hadn't explained. I told her about Detective Brooks and the fuel line. For the first time since I'd known her, Rebecca looked genuinely shaken. "That changes everything, does it?" "It means Michael's concerns may have been much more than financial." She stood and walked to a locked filing cabinet. After removing a single folder, she placed it on the desk. "I can show you this now." "Why?" Inside was a letter signed by Michael several months before his death. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply stated that if circumstances ever prevented him from completing certain legal instructions, Rebecca was to delay any major changes involving the company until specific financial records had been independently reviewed. There were no accusations, no names, no explanations. Only one handwritten sentence at the bottom, truth first. Decision second. I stared at the familiar handwriting. "That's him." Rebecca nodded. "He insisted on writing that line himself." Before I could say another word, her office phone rang. She answered, listened for less than 30 seconds, and slowly lowered the receiver. "What happened?" "Someone entered Michael's office last night. I felt my heart sink." "Was anything taken?" "We don't know yet." "Who found it?" "The cleaning supervisor." She stood immediately. "I'm going over there. So am I." By the time we reached Harper Industrial Supply, Detective Brooks was already inside the building with two crime scene technicians. Yellow evidence markers sat on the floor of Michael's office. The room looked surprisingly neat. Nothing had been overturned. Low drawers had been ripped open. If someone had searched the office, they had done it carefully. Brooks met us near the doorway. "Glad you're here. What happened?" I asked. He pointed toward a tall filing cabinet. The lock was picked. "Anything missing?" "We're still comparing inventory." Ryan stepped out from the hallway before Brooks could continue. He looked exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. "This is getting out of hand." Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out." Ryan shook his head. "My father dies." He glanced briefly toward me before continuing. "Now someone's breaking into his office." No one answered because there wasn't an answer. As the technicians photographed the room, my attention drifted toward a framed picture sitting on Michael's desk. It showed the two of us standing outside the company's first warehouse almost 30 years earlier. Something about it seemed wrong. I stepped closer. The frame itself hadn't moved, but the layer of dust beneath it someone had picked it up recently. "Detective." Brooks walked over. "What is it?" I pointed. The picture. he frowned. What about it? It was moved. How can you tell? I carefully lifted the frame. A clean rectangle marked where it had rested for years. Taped to the underside of the wooden backing was a small folded sheet of paper. Brooks stopped me before I touched it. Don't. One of the technicians photographed it before slipping on gloves and removing the note. Inside was nothing more than a list of dates. At first, they meant nothing. Then Brooks looked closer. These are shipping dates. Rebecca leaned in. Lafer. They matched the weeks Michael came to see me. I felt the pieces beginning to shift, not together, but closer. Brooks handed the paper to one of the technicians. Cross-reference every shipment. Ryan looked from the note to me. I don't understand any of this. Neither did I. Not completely. But for the first time since Michael's death, something important had surfaced because someone else had gone looking for it. Whoever entered that office hadn't found what they were searching for. Instead, they had accidentally led us straight to it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael standing in the boat with that sealed envelope in his hands, trying to decide whether to trust me with it. Then the memory would shift to the list of shipping dates hidden behind the photograph in his office. He hadn't hidden it where an accountant would think to look. That was the kind of thing only Michael would do. The next morning, Detective Brooks called before I had finished my first cup of coffee. We've matched the dates, and they all correspond to shipments that were processed after normal business hours. Luis mentioned trucks leaving late. He did. So he was right. Brooks paused. He was observant. What was on those shipments? On paper. I didn't like the way he emphasized those words. Go on, they were listed as routine industrial supplies. And in reality, we're still confirming. Lie. His careful wording told me he already suspected the answer. I need you to come to Rebecca's office. I'll leave now. When I arrived, Rebecca, Brooks, and Olivia were already there. Ryan stood near the window with his arms crossed, looking as though he hadn't slept any more than I had. He nodded politely when I entered, but the warmth that had once existed between us was still missing. Rebecca spread several documents across the conference table. These are copies of the shipping manifests. They look normal, I said. They do. She slid another stack beside them. These are the warehouse inventory reports. I compared the numbers. At first glance, everything balanced. Then I noticed something. The quantities don't match. Brooks nodded. Not by much. No, but enough. Rebecca pointed to one particular shipment. Michael highlighted this one during one of our meetings. Why? Because according to the paperwork, 40 industrial pumps were delivered, and the receiving warehouse confirmed only 28. I frowned. 12 disappeared? Brooks folded his hands. The customer paid for 40, so someone pocketed the difference. We don't know yet. Ryan finally spoke. This could just be a bookkeeping mistake. No one dismissed the possibility. In fact, Brooks nodded. That's exactly what we hoped. But we found the same pattern 17 times. The room fell silently. 17 wasn't a mistake. It was a system. Rebecca opened another folder. Thomas. She looked directly at me. I think it's time. Without another word, she reached into her briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It looked almost identical to the one Michael had nearly handed me on the lake. He left this with me. When? The day after your fishing trip was scheduled. I stared at her. But he canceled our appointment. She nodded. He mailed it instead. Ryan stepped forward. What is it? Rebecca looked at all of us before answering. I was instructed not to open it unless two conditions were met. What conditions? Brooks asked. Evidence of financial misconduct. She paused. An independent confirmation that Michael was no longer alive. The room remained perfectly still. Those conditions have now been met. She carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, Michael's handwriting. Rebecca began reading aloud. Why? If you're hearing this, then I wasn't able to finish what I started. If I'm wrong about my concerns, I apologize to everyone whose time this letter wasted. But if I'm right, don't accuse anyone until the evidence speaks for itself. Suspicion destroys families faster than dishonesty ever could. I felt my throat tighten. That sounded exactly like him. Rebecca continued. For months, I've believed someone inside my business has been using legitimate shipments to hide false inventory records. I refused to name anyone because I never had complete proof. If you are reading this, then I hope you have more than I did. Ryan lowered his eyes. The anger he'd carried for weeks had begun giving way to something else. Regret, Rebecca turned the page. There is one person I trust to keep his word when keeping it becomes painful. Thomas doesn't know everything I've discovered, and that is intentional. I asked him only to protect time, not secrets. If he has remained silent, it is because I asked him to. The room became so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall. Ryan looked at me slowly. You, his voice. You really didn't know? I shook my head. No, I thought. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he crossed the room. I owe you an apology. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You owe me nothing today. No. His eyes filled with tears. I do. Brooks allowed the moment to pass before clearing his throat. The letter answers one question. There, Rebecca said. What happened to the missing inventory? Just then, there was a knock at the conference room door. Lewis stepped inside. I'm sorry to interrupt. Brooks motioned him in. What is it? Luis carried an old cardboard records box. We've been cleaning out the original warehouse. He placed the box on the table. This was hidden above the ceiling tiles in the old office. Rebecca carefully opened it. Inside were dozens of notebooks. Not one, dozens. Each one dated, each one handwritten. Michael hadn't merely been taking notes. He had been documenting everything: purchase orders, shipment numbers, vendor meetings, late-night truck departures, license plate numbers, names of employees working overtime, even conversations he considered unusual. Brooks opened one at random. His eyebrows rose. This, he looked toward Rebecca, is enough to reconstruct nearly every shipment. Why? Ryan stared at the notebooks in disbelief. My dad kept all this? For almost a year, Rebecca answered. Brooks flipped several more pages before stopping. I think we finally know why someone broke into the office. They were looking for these, I said. He nodded. And they failed. Over the next several weeks, investigators compared Michael's notebooks with bank records, invoices, GPS logs from company trucks, and warehouse security footage that had been archived off-site. What began as a suspected accounting problem grew into something much larger. A small group of trusted managers had been altering shipment records, redirecting inventory, and disguising the losses through carefully adjusted paperwork. The scheme had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years while remaining just subtle enough to avoid routine audits. The evidence never pointed toward Ryan or Olivia. Neither of them had known. The real betrayal had come from people Michael had hired, promoted, and trusted. When Detective Brooks called me one final time before the arrests became public, his voice carried a quiet satisfaction. You were right about one thing. Lie. I've been wrong plenty. You told me Michael believed numbers told stories. I smiled sadly. He did. Brooks paused. And thanks to him, he looked down at the notebooks lying on his desk. This story finally tells the truth. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael standing in the boat with that sealed envelope in his hands, trying to decide whether to trust me with it. Then, the memory would shift to the list of shipping dates hid behind the photograph in his office. He hadn't hidden it where an accountant would think to look. He'd hidden it behind a memory. That was the kind of thing only Michael would do. The next morning, Detective Brooks called before I had finished my first cup of coffee. We've matched the dates, and they all correspond to shipments that were processed after normal business hours. Luis mentioned trucks leaving late. He did. So he was right. Brooks paused. He was observant. What was on those shipments? On paper. I didn't like the way he emphasized those words. Go on. They were listed as routine industrial supplies, and in reality, we're still confirming. His careful wording told me he already suspected the answer. I need you to come to Rebecca's office. I'll leave now. When I arrived, Rebecca, Brooks, and Olivia were already there. Ryan stood near the window with his arms crossed, looking as though he hadn't slept any more than I had. He nodded politely when I entered, but the warmth that had once existed between us was still missing. Rebecca spread several documents across the conference table. These are copies of the shipping manifest. They look normal, I said. They do. She slid another stack beside them. These are the warehouse inventory reports. I compared the numbers at first glance, everything balanced. Then I noticed something. The quantities don't match. Brooks nodded. Not by much, but enough. Rebecca pointed to one particular shipment. Michael highlighted this one during one of our meetings. Why? Because according to the paperwork, 40 industrial pumps were delivered. And the receiving warehouse confirmed only 28. I frowned. 12 disappeared? On paper. Brooks folded his hands. The customer paid for 40. So someone pocketed the difference. We don't know yet. Ryan finally spoke. This could just be a bookkeeping mistake. No one dismissed the possibility. In fact, Brooks nodded. That's exactly what we hoped. But we found the same pattern 17 times. The room fell silent. 17 wasn't a mistake. It was a system. Rebecca opened another folder. Thomas, she looked directly at me. I think it's time. Without another word, she reached into her briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Lee. It looked almost identical to the one Michael had nearly handed me on the lake. He left this with me. When? The day after your fishing trip was scheduled. I stared at her. But he canceled our appointment. She nodded. He mailed it instead. Ryan stepped forward. What is it? Rebecca looked at all of us before answering. I was instructed not to open it unless two conditions were met. What conditions? Brooks asked. Evidence of financial misconduct. She paused. And independent confirmation that Michael was no longer alive. The room remained perfectly still. Those conditions have now been met. She carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, Michael's handwriting. Rebecca began reading aloud. If you're hearing this, then I wasn't able to finish what I started. If I'm wrong about my concerns, I apologize to everyone whose time this letter wasted. But if I'm right, don't accuse anyone until the evidence speaks for itself. Lee. Suspicion destroys families faster than dishonesty ever could. I felt my throat tighten. That sounded exactly like him. Rebecca continued. For months, I've believed someone inside my business has been using legitimate shipments to hide false inventory records. I refuse to name anyone because I never had complete proof. If you are reading this, then I hope you have more than I did. Ryan lowered his eyes. The anger he'd carried for weeks had begun giving way to something else. Regret. Rebecca turned the page. There is one person I trust to keep his word when keeping it becomes painful. Thomas doesn't know everything I've discovered, and that is intentional. I asked him only to protect time, not secrets. If he has remained silent, it is because I asked him to. The room became so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall. Ryan looked at me slowly.
You. His voice broke. Really didn't know?
I shook my head. No, I thought, I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, he crossed the room. I owe you an apology. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You owe me nothing today. No. His eyes filled with tears. I do. Brooks allowed the moment to pass before clearing his throat. The letter answers one question. Look. And creates another, Rebecca said. What happened to the missing inventory? Just then, there was a knock at the conference room door. Louis stepped inside. I'm sorry to interrupt. Brooks motioned him in. What is it? Louise carried an old cardboard records box. We've been cleaning out the original warehouse. He placed the box on the table. This was hidden above the ceiling tiles in the old office. Rebecca carefully opened it. Inside were dozens of notebooks. Not one. Leg. Dozens. Each one dated. Each one handwritten. Michael hadn't merely been taking notes. He had been documenting everything. Purchase orders, shipment numbers, vendor meetings, late-night truck departures, license plate numbers, names of employees working overtime, even conversations he considered unusual. Brooks opened one at random. His eyebrows rose. This, he looked toward Rebecca, is enough to reconstruct nearly every shipment. Ryan stared at the notebooks in disbelief. My dad kept all this? For almost a year, Rebecca answered. Brooks flipped several more pages before stopping. I think we finally know why someone broke into the office. They were looking for these, I said. He nodded, and they failed. Over the next several weeks, investigators compared Michael's notebooks with bank records, invoices, GPS logs from company trucks, and warehouse security footage that had been archived off-site. What began as a suspected accounting problem grew into something much larger. A small group of trusted managers had been altering shipment records, redirecting inventory, and disguising the losses through carefully adjusted paperwork. Lie. The scheme had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years while remaining just subtle enough to avoid routine audits. The evidence never pointed toward Ryan or Olivia. Neither of them had known. The real betrayal had come from people Michael had hired, promoted, and trusted. When Detective Brooks called me one final time before the arrest became public, his voice carried a quiet satisfaction. You were right about one thing. I've been wrong plenty. You told me Michael believed numbers told stories. I smiled sadly. He did. Brooks paused, and thanks to him, he looked down at the notebooks lying on his desk. This story finally tells the truth.